A very good evening. A warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay. Welcome to a rather rainy afternoon here in Johannesburg, hence the rain jacket that's on as I dashed fearlessly across my back garden to get to the cellar from where we film most weeks when we're not on the road. And welcome to a show I've been looking forward to all weekend, because not only do I have some sensational wine lined up to charge through myself, but I've also got three wonderful, wonderful guests to share that wine and to share stories with over the next hour or thereabouts. One of them is very familiar to this show and very familiar to the wine world. He's South Africa's preeminent expert on the world of the great Michael Fridjhon. He'll be with us in just a moment. And it's part of a conversation we're having that looks at two things in particular. One of them is barrels, which we've never really spoken about in too much detail on Dan Really Likes Wine. It's a great time to do that today. What is the barrel process? How much difference do they make? Is the use of barrels changing? Are we shying away from the newer stuff and looking at the slightly older barrels and letting the fruit have more of a story to tell? Lots of conversation to be had there. And then talking about Burgundy and our own little South African Burgundy, being the Hemel-En-Aarde, as we draw comparisons between and look for a couple of differences between the Hemel-En-Aarde and Burgundy through two wonderful wine brands. One of them is Louis Latour, one of France's most established and most successful and most sought after. And the other, a man who in just a decade has gone from this label didn't even exist to, well, we can't buy any because it's sold out before it even hits the market. Hannes Storm and his Storm wine. So meeting all three of those guests in just a moment. Before I do that, grab your diary, grab a pen, or stick it into your laptop or your digital diary, because it is a busy week for Dan Really Likes Wine. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, we'll launch a brand new 8-part series with Boschendal, myself, and Maps Maponyane. We'll be interviewing a series of entrepreneurs over a glass or two of the Nicholl, and we kick off with Catherine Constantinides, the social entrepreneur, discuss her work with people like Barack Obama and the time she spent in refugee camps in North Africa, Syria, and Afghanistan. Some harrowing stuff, but also some uplifting stuff. Wednesday, 5 o'clock. We don't normally have a Wednesday show, but Wednesday we do. We are live from Element House with Erica Obermeyer and a series of special guests for the launch of the brand new vintage of the Element. Working wonders again is Erica. This is a wine not to be missed. Thursday's show, we're back in cellar, back in studio, and we'll be joined by Mike Radcliffe, who's just won World Producer of the Year for his Villafonte wine at the IWSC Awards, almost as big as getting an Old Mutual Trophy Wine Show Award. So we'll have Mike in, and we'll also have the mentors from KWV. Zell will be joining us with her brand new vintages, the mad scientist of KWV, and some terrific, terrific wine. So it's a busy week for the show. Also, the opening of Zoo, David Higgs' brand new spot. That'll be Thursday night, reporting in from there as well. But right now, we have barrels, we have Burgundy, and we have Hemel-En-Aarde to talk to about. So a very warm welcome to Michael, to Bruno, and to Hannes. Welcome, guys. Lovely to have you.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Hello, thank you. Thanks a lot.
We have a lot to talk about today, so let's charge straight into it. And the first part of our conversation is around barrels, but I want to set the Burgundy Hemel-En-Aarde scene as we kick off. And Michael, maybe sum that up for us. For you, Hemel-En-Aarde versus Burgundy, both making fantastic Chardonnay, both making fantastic Pinot Noir. What, broadly speaking, are the similarities, the differences between the two regions?
So the Hemel-En-Aarde claim to being the kind of Burgundy of the Cape was a positioning statement made by the late Tim Hamilton Russell when he planted the first modern vineyards there more than 40 years ago. And that was driven by the fact that the climate and the maritime influence and the fact that the vineyards were relatively southerly put them all together in a much cooler place than the traditional grape growing areas that were mainstream at the time. And to the point, in fact, that he, at one stage, had a Cabernet vineyard that he simply couldn't ripen. And different clonal material and climate change have certainly transformed it. But the key elements are that the weather is cooler. It still benefits, which is different, of course, from Burgundy. It's essentially a Mediterranean climate. It's a cooler Mediterranean climate. It's a winter rainfall climate. And what we've discovered over the years is that very small differences in terms of distance from the coast, Hemel-En-Aarde Valley, upper Hemel-En-Aarde, Hemel-En-Aarde Ridge, tend to produce markedly different wines. So I don't think anybody for a moment is asserting that Hemel-En-Aarde is another Burgundy. It's a fabulous place to grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And over 40 years, those people brave enough to have invested not just money, but their hopes and aspirations in producing high quality wine from those two Burgundian varietals have been more than rewarded, as long as they keep their noses to the grindstone and don't try and do anything that those varietals don't like.
Well, that sets the scene rather nicely. Let's now move to one of those two areas and start with our French guest. Bruno, tell us a little bit about Louis Latour and its story, and where you are in the world, and what you feel your little part of Burgundy lends itself to in terms of consistently making such great Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Yeah, there's there would be a lot to say about what Michael has said about Burgundy and the history of Burgundy, and of course, the interest that there is when it comes to Pinot and especially Pinot. I would say before Chardonnay. Chardonnay has been planted in many places for years, but Pinot is definitely a great variety where Burgundy has, historically produced stunning wine, and more and more we've seen the new world, if I may say, about South Africa or Australia, where vineyards have been planted for almost 200 years, of course. But when it comes to Pinot and Chardonnay, it's relatively new. There's a lot to say about it. Before I talk about Louis Latour, I would say that in every place I go around the world, whether it's to sell wine or to sell barrels, I'll come back on that. I have friends who are trying to grow Pinot in their backyards, just to try to achieve something that is close to Burgundy. And I would link that to what Michael just said, and I think what he said is very right. I have come across a lot more and many Pinots and many Chardonnays that are really exciting around the world, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Australia, whether it's some places in the US. But as Michael rightly said, don't try to make wines that taste like wines from Burgundy. I think everyone has its own identity, and what I like when I taste wine myself is actually to taste wines that where I do understand, as soon as I taste them, the provenance and the origin of the wine, and that's more important than anything else. And I think one of the at the end of the day, it's what I do call identity. Wine should have an identity. So when it comes to Louis Latour, we've been around for more than 200 years. And interestingly, the family, when they started, they were not winemakers. They were actually barrel makers. We're going to talk a little bit about barrels later on, but I'd like to insist on that. In the mid 18th century, the Louis Latour family, already run by Louis, were barrel makers, and it's only after the French Revolution that they invested into wine and started producing wine in Burgundy. So I'm not sure where you want to take it from there, but what I'd like to say, we are a family-owned company. We've been around for 200 years. And humbly, I would say that we still learn about Burgundy every day. We still experiment in Burgundy. Our motto is to try to improve whatever we can in the winemaking, in the wine growing, in the aging, and we have to cope with the modern weather conditions as well. One could think that we have nothing to prove because we've been there for many years. But at the end of the day, Burgundy is becoming rarer and more expensive. So whatever we produce needs to be of high quality, because we need to make sure that we make the most if we can, the most if we get from our fantastic vineyards that we have in Burgundy.
And you do that most consistently, as we'll be discovering just a little later. I'm going to come back to the barrel conversation in a moment, but let's head down to the Hemel-En-Aarde Valley and get the other side of the coin of our wine tonight. Hannes, the story is a great one, and I'll get it from you in detail in a moment. But set the scene for you, the Hemel-En-Aarde Valley. It's, I think, a great marketing term initially, but I get the sense that Hemel-En-Aarde's kind of outgrown that and is really quite comfortable on its own terms now.
Yeah, definitely, Dan. I think it's always been exciting to work here in the valley. My first vintage year was 2000, and I always used to do some mountain biking and jogging on the farms and really treaded on the soils of the area. And I think the main characteristic of the Hemel-En-Aarde that makes it very special is we are so close to the cool Atlantic Ocean, and then from a climate point of view, and then secondly, the main factor is the soils. I think. Low vigor soils, clay-rich soils, and really just fantastic soils to work with. And I think in the past 10 years or so many things happened here in the valley. Such great paradigm shifts happened, and the focus is absolutely on the soils and the sites. And you can see that from all the producers making wine. And obviously, the Hamilton Russells lay the foundation in 1976 when they planted the first vines. I think it's fantastic to work here, and it's really also quite rural still and not too commercialized, which is really quite cool. I think vine age is probably the only thing that we can improve on, and that is just that's something we cannot do anything about at the moment. But I mean, I would say vines of 20-25 years old here up to 30 years is becoming something that is fantastic to showcase the terroirs and the area's wines. So and then from a Chardonnay point of view, also I think the area is also then very, very characteristic. Brings about very characteristic Chardonnays, more the citrus minerality, and that again is a function of the low yielding soils. I always say that clay in soils for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is very important for the textural components, and it's fun to work with them also. Should I just want to say something very quickly about the three appellations. Is that fine, Dave?
We're going to come to that wine in a moment. So let's hang on there for just a second, because I want to jump into this barrel conversation, and I'll come straight back to you if I may, Hannes. Barrels in South Africa. You ask a winemaker, South African winemakers and the French winemakers I've met as well, all very humble people. They take as little credit as they can for wine that they've actually put a whole lot of effort and time into making what it is. We know about the role of the terroir. We know that a great winemaker is rather important. What about the barrels? How much of a role is it playing? And is that role changing? Is it one that's in flux at the moment?
I always have a traditional point of view, and if the cultures that we work with, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir it's been working for centuries. The way it's been made, so I do believe in a barrel, a 228-liter barrel. For us, the whole philosophy of the business is basically to express the terroirs that we work with in barrel, in bottle at the end. And by having that, we have to use very subtle influences from the oak, and that's just mainly maybe a more tight grain oak, a lighter toast. Some of the barrels no toast at all, just to enhance the quality of the wine without adding too much sweetness or viscosity and caramel characters. If anything, we only want a bit of spice to enhance the fruit and to make it a better wine at the end. But I think for us, barrels are quite important as long as it's subtle and on the background to enhance the actual terroir characteristics.
We've got a number of people watching, and Po Sugar, it's a busy week. Can't wait. Well, and Po, we're glad to have you here, and I'm sure we'll see more of you during the week. Michael Crossley, great to see you, Bruno. Thanks for joining the show. We are equally grateful, and good to have you watching, Michael. Bruno, the story of barrels, it's clearly something that's particularly special to the Louis Latour story. Tell us a little bit about the world of barrels in France and the role that you feel they play in the wine industry.
Yeah, again, there's a lot that could be said about it. What many people may not know, talking about barrels in general, is that in France there are about 50 barrel makers in total of different sizes, but on average, I would say 50 barrel makers, and they're also what less people know, 50 what we call mérandiers. The mérandiers are the one who are auctioning the forest. I mean, the ONF, the National Forest industry, puts some part of the forest in auction, and the mérandier would bid. It's a negative bid. Would bid on this forest and go and cut and deliver and sell the oak to us once it's prepared and ready for aging. So these are 50 very small industries. You're talking about industries that are producing 300 to 500 cubic meter of wood every year. So make on average about €1 million turnover. So it's very, very fragmented when it comes to the production. When it comes to us, I mean, we use 5 different mérandiers. 3 of them are very historical. We've been working with them for several generations. The oak comes from mostly Tronchet, Bertrange, Morvan, which are local Burgundian forest, and some from the Vosges, which is more on the east as well. So as a company, we produce about 3,500 barrels a year. 1/3 we'd be using, and about 2/3 we would be exporting to various markets.
Well, give an illustration. I think most people wouldn't really know too much about the process. How easy is it to make a barrel? How do you put one together? What is the story from tree cut down to voila, here's my finished product?
Right. Basically, we buy staves, and we buy them by cubic meter, and they're delivered to us. That's the first step. Then we age them for a while. What we mean by we age them is that it's basically we do nothing. We leave them outside for a minimum of 3 years. All the staves coming from used for Louis Latour barrels are aged 36 to 42 months minimum before they are actually used. And this is a key point when it comes to producing quality. It means we do no étuvage, no fast aging process that would hide the natural tannins that define the oak. But the oak stayed outside for at least 3 years. Then it's assembled to make it a barrels. It is assembled, and it's what we call we toast them, and everybody's got his technique and his recipe to actually toast the barrels to make it's special special quality to. And what's fantastic about Louis Latour is that my wife is actually very easy, because I only sell one type of barrels. Most companies producing barrels would be offering barrels from oak from different regions, different countries, barrels from different sizes, barrels from different type of toast. At Louis Latour, we only make only one type of barrel that we use only for the very best wine and all the best wines that we have from Burgundy, and we ship and we export exactly the same type of barrel, which is a low toast, long but low, very light toast that brings some structure and complexity to the wine.
If we go back to Mr. Fridjhon then, Michael, how much of the world of barrels has changed for you in the brief period of time you've been in the wine industry, and where do we sit barrel-wise in South Africa?
So it's been very interesting. There were obviously large foudres, and in the old cellars of the Cape, you see them. They're often beautifully carved. Some of them still in use, but it's only in the late 1970s that small French oak barrels were really introduced into the industry, and they were primarily brought in for red wine. We didn't have any real Chardonnay in those days. And then we had the Chardonnay scandal. And in the second half of the 80s, we suddenly had quite a lot of Chardonnay as well. But the barrels that first came to South Africa, they emulated primarily the Bordeaux size and the Bordeaux toast. And we went through a period where some of the large French cooperages thought that they'd won the lotto because South Africa was buying wood, and we didn't know a great deal about how to go about choosing the wood, choosing the barrels. So we were the dumping ground for some quite bad oak in the, I suppose, the middle 80s. But our industry is nothing if not resilient and innovative. And certainly by the 1990s, we had real skills when it comes to choosing barrels and trying to marry the barrel to the style of wine you want. And there was also a fashion which was very strong through the 90s, in which consumers identified the smell of new wood on wine as an indication of a luxury premium product, a bit like the smell of leather in a new motor car. And so we went through a time where heavy toasting, lots of char, lots of caramel created the impression of wine quality. We've passed through that phase now, and there was quite a strong reaction against it. So there are other alternatives which have become very fashionable, from so-called amphora and concrete eggs and simply cement tanks, all of which are part of a swing away from excessive oaking of wine. But if you use a barrel properly, and if you use older wood, which has become particularly fashionable, not only amongst garagists and people who specialize in old vineyard wine, where they really see the barrel as a container rather than a contributor to flavor. We've now advanced to the point where people who are making particularly Burgundian varieties, but also those varieties where you want to capture the freshness of the fruit of the grape, have looked to a different quality of wood. It's generally very tight grained. And what they are in fact trying to do is allow the wine to evolve very slowly, not to over contribute barrel taste, to get instead the quality of what happens to wine in a barrel, particularly if it's exposed to the lees for a protracted period of time. And so what we're seeing now is a completely new generation of wines where the wood is very subtle, and we're getting not so much wood richness, but instead much more finesse. And that comes from a particular style of wood. And I have to say, although this is not yet, I think, fully recognized in the industry, from a certain size of barrel, there has been a move to much larger barrels. People see it as a saving in wood cost. If you have a 300 liter or a 500 liter barrel, you can age 300 or 500 liters in an object that costs very little more than a 225 or 228 liter barrel. But the reality is that it's not about the wood ratio to the wine alone. It's also about the very slow micro-oxygenation, which is afforded by barrels and which isn't available through many of the other containers that have come into fashion. So it really is a very dynamic market at the moment. We've been on a steep learning curve since the 1970s, and we've come to a point now where the finest of wines are not resting on wood as an alternative to fruit quality, but merely as a platform for it.
Two follow-up questions from a fairly comprehensive analysis there. Thank you. Locally produced oak, is that much of a story? Is that something we're doing in South Africa? And then wood staves, very clever idea or absolute heresy? Okay, so the first one, locally produced oak. The French oak that they use, which is a European oak, we certainly don't have those forests here, and certainly not on a scale that makes it possible. We have had locally assembled barrels. We've had some very good coopers in the Cape. Our brandy industry has gone through a lot more wood than the wine industry has ever done.
So there are people who certainly know how to make, how to repair, and how to manage barrels. So we really do have a tradition of cooperage in the Cape, but we don't have the wood that we need for it. To move on to your question of staves, that's really, if you can't put your wine into the wood, you put your wood into the wine. It's a bit like a tea bag effect. It gives you the flavor that you might derive from an oak barrel, and from that perspective, you can also use wood chips, but you're not getting the micro-oxygenation. You're really fast-tracking the idea of oaky wine. It's the fake leather seats that look and feel and smell like leather, but aren't actually the leather seats in your new motor car. You shouldn't be using the barrel or the stave to flavor the wine. You should be using the barrel in order to aid a particular style of maturation, which the wine needs, because the one thing you really can't do much about is that wine needs to age to a certain extent before you can release it and sell it to consumers.
I'm not sure the analogy of fake leather has ever been in a positive sense, and I suspect that extends to this particular comparison. Thank you, Michael. Let's jump away from barrels and head over to the wine itself. Hannes, give us the summary of this story. We were talking just before we came on to the show about how in a decade you've done something marvelous and something unusual, and that you've created this brand out of nothing, and it's now so successful that unless you've got Hannes's mobile phone number and he decides to answer it, you can't actually get any of this wine. It is very, very sought after. So it's been an extraordinary decade. Give us the story leading up to the start of Storm Wine, and then how you've made things go quite so right for yourself.
I think it was basically just hard work and a lot of tears at some stage. Focus on what we can do best and stick to your knitting and that type of thing. It is my journey in the Hemel-En-Aarde basically started in 2000 while I was doing some mountain biking and jogging in the valley, and I did my university practical here at Hamilton-Russell at that stage, and I started there and then as a permanent employee in 2001, and the rest is history. Basically 13 years 13 vintages at Hamilton-Russell, and then in that time I was always searching for some project for myself. It's always like all my predecessors at Hamilton-Russell. It's either you go overseas or you start your own brand, and I had enough energy to really jump into the thick of things and take it from there. So I was very privileged to bump onto these two vineyards, the Storm Vrede vineyard and the Ignis vineyard. They were planted in 2008 on the Bokkerveld shale-derived clay soils then in the Hemel-En-Aarde Valley, as well as the upper Hemel-En-Aarde, the decomposed granite soils. And then 5 years after that, the rich Pinot Noir came onto the stage, and that's also from the Bokkerveld shale. And I think for us, what worked very well is we really have very special sites that we work with in these three appellations, and that I think is basically just a characteristic of the soils, and then also the low yielding aspect of the soils. I think when you have the right soils and the right climate close to the ocean and the yields are low, especially with two sensitive cultivars in the Hemel-En-Aarde, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, I think one can really, if you do your part well and not interfere too much, let the soil do their work and make sure everything is hygienic in the cellar, I think you can do something special. And basically, our first vintage was then the maiden vintage was 2012 for the Pinot Noirs, and the Chardonnays came on board in 2015. And the whole philosophy of our business is just basically to showcase the terroirs into the bottle, into the glass, without any interference from our side. I always say, from a winemaking point of view, there are only two things that are important, or one word basically, and that's hygiene. And then the other thing that's really important is the fact is just the picking date and the time of picking. That decision is very, 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 very crucial to ensure that the wine showcase the terroir and not overripe and overt fruitiness. And I think that's basically what we try and do. And then the other important part. We wanted to create wines that are able to mature well. So they are ready to be consumed and enjoyed upon release, but it's also wines then that really can be laid down for years. And as long as the wine retain their freshness, I think Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is much more interesting when they have some age on them. And I think in the New World, in the past 5 to 10 years, in the New World, we see fantastic pockets of winemaking areas or terroirs out there. From just out of the Mornington Peninsula to New Zealand, Oregon, Santa Barbara area that really showcases some fantastic wines. And I think the Hemel-En-Aarde is one of those areas that can really planted at the right place in the right soils, close to the ocean, and standing back a bit for the soils to do their part. I think one can really create something special. And I think we've been very privileged in 10 years now to just stick to our guns, and that's where we will be for the next 10 years, I suppose. Yeah.
As always with South African winemakers, a very humble response to the question, but summing up, I think the success quite well. I'd like to sum it up with a little bit more praise. So let me head over to our wine critic extraordinaire. Michael, what for you has made Hannes's wine stand out and have got him to a stage after just a decade where, he's only making 300 cases or thereabouts of each of these Pinot Noirs, for example. They are all on consignment. They're all disappearing extremely quickly. And there is a cult fan base around him.
I mean, there are many things, Dan. There are many things, and there are very few things, which I know just sounds like I'm hedging it. But what Hannes said right at the beginning, the importance of fruit quality, the importance of cellar hygiene, and the importance of focus. Those all sound very simple. But to do it in reality, firstly, he is largely responsible for everything, if not quite from the early plantings to everything since then. He's chosen his locations. He is very conscious, as he said, of the underlying soils. He knows the valley intimately and knows what to expect from the kind of climatic conditions which are dominated by Walker Bay. It's a very coastal location, and so the kind of force of climate does come from the ocean. So you need to know that and understand that. You need then, of course, to both trellis and manage your canopy in accordance with the climatic conditions. You have to anticipate and manage events like the drought. And then once the fruit comes into the cellar, the extraordinary thing is that you have to be gentle, but you still have to get everything you can out of the Pinot Noir. It's an infinitely subtle and sometimes I think a little malignant kind of grape. If you don't pay it attention, it can be very sulky. And so it really needs to be coaxed. And I must say, I suspect, I don't know, that if Hannes were a fly fisherman, he'd be winning most of the competitions, because that's really what you have to do with your Pinot. And you do need to be conscious of the fact that people who truly love Pinot want to taste the fruit. They want to taste the fruit, and from the fruit, they want to taste the origin. So the one unifier across all three of his vineyards is the purity of the expression of the place. And for people who are Pinot buffs, the kind of geeks of the world of Pinot, that's exactly what you want. You don't want just the wine to be different. You want to know why the wine is different, and you expect it to express itself in the same way, allowing for vintage variation every year.
Well, that's, I think you need to just print that out and get that written down on your website there, Hannes. You've got a big fan in Mr. Fridjhon. Yeah, let's head back to France and back to Beaune. And we've got the Santonnet, which we're going to be trying in just a moment. You've got quite a big operation going with Louis Latour, Bruno. What are the challenges in terms of managing everything that you do and ensuring that despite the scale, you're able to keep an eye on everything and make sure everything lives up to the name that you guys have created over so many years?
Yeah, I say I'm going to bounce back on what Hannes said and Michael. Producing wine, and especially Pinot, is about attention to details. It's about trying to have yes, we are relatively large for Burgundy standards, but at the end of the day, if you look at all our holdings and whatever we look after in Burgundy itself, it's no bigger than a first growth chateau in Bordeaux. It's just that instead of producing one appellation, we do produce about 100. So it means that we have to know the vineyards better. We have to know the sites better. One point that Hannes got right again is the more it goes, the more we find we need to pay attention to the picking date. And the warming climate, although it has done a lot of good for the red Burgundies, for the Pinots, it has been, at Louis Latour, we've noticed that it's been more and more challenging for Chardonnay. And the picking window when it comes to Chardonnay is sometimes no more than 4 days. So luckily today we have more system and more ways to make an analysis of the level of ripeness and acidity in the wine, so we know when to pick. But yes, what is more difficult maybe at our level is that we know about the terroir, we know about the soil, we know what potential is there. We need to make the most of the grapes we're getting, and it's all going back to attention to details, and so is the aging and the oak barrels. The oak barrels shouldn't hide the fruit, shouldn't hide the work that's done before. It's just one of these details that we have to be careful about, and every year is different. Just don't take for granted that because you've done well in a specific vintage, you're going to do exactly the same thing the next one. Every vintage we have to sit and look at the kind of fruit, the kind of weather we've had, the kind of fruit we're going to get, and try to adapt our winemaking. And that goes all the way until the bottling time. Some vintage we would bottle much earlier, some vintage we would bottle later. It's just every year is a new year. Every vintage is a new vintage, and that's how you can be successful over the years. But consistency is a key point.
We're going to test that consistency in a moment. My Pinot Noir is open and raring to go. I'm going to ask you a very difficult question here, Bruno, and I'm sure you're equipped to answer it. In a very brief space of time, can you explain for South Africans to whom this is quite an alien space, how the idea of classification works with wine in Burgundy? Because I've just almost finished a book on Burgundy that Michael's very kindly lent me, and it's opened my eyes to the detail and nuance of how the Burgundy classification system works. But if you can give us the annotated version and give our South African viewers an understanding of the world of Burgundy wines.
I think it could be part of a 1 hour show, Dan. I mean, if I start explaining from the beginning. Let me try to put things in perspective briefly. Throughout the years, because Burgundy was planted 2,000 years ago, throughout the years, the Burgundians realized that Pinot and Chardonnay ended up producing better wines than the other grape varieties. So in the late 14th century, Gamay, for example, was removed and forbidden in Burgundy. So we started focusing on 2 grape varieties, which makes your life much easier to identify which are the best vineyards to produce good wines. Then in 1855, and that's important, in 1855, Burgundians were asked to come with a classification of Burgundy. In the same time, Bordeaux was asked to come with a classification. There was 2 ways. Bordeaux came with a classification of 5 growths, first, second, third, and so on. But the Bordeaux classification was not a terroir-driven classification. It was a brand classification. It was a chateau classification. When the Burgundians saw that classification coming up in Bordeaux, they reacted in saying, well, this is not the way we see things. We believe there are terroir, there are pieces of land that produces better wine than others. And they came with a 4-level classification. At the bottom end, we have what we call the regional wines. So Bourgogne Rouge, Bourgogne Pinot Noir, Bourgogne White, Bourgogne Chardonnay. These account for that 50% of the total production of Burgundy. Then we have grapes coming from specific villages, like you would have Chardonnay from Hermanus or Chardonnay from Franschhoek or whatever. These are what we call villages. You know, there's Pommard, there's Volnay, there's Alox-Corton, Vaud-Romanée, Meursault, Puligny, Chassagne, Chablis, and so on. These are villages. It's a second level of the classification. The third level of the classification is what we call the premier cru. So this is what I would say to compare. These are the single vineyards within a village. So you would have, for example, Meursault followed by Geneuvrière, Meursault followed by Blagny, Meursault followed by Perrières. These are single vineyards that are within the villages of Meursault. They are part of it, but they are considered as producing better grapes, superior wines. They only account for 15% of the production. Then right on top, less than 2% of the production of Burgundy is actually what we call Grand Cru. So the Grand Cru are the famous wines, you know, the Romanée Conti, the Chambertin, the Corton Charlemagne, the Montrachet. These are the wines that everybody would dream about, and that's what makes that as what has put Burgundy on the map. They're also obviously the most expensive wines that you find in Burgundy, but they only account for less than 2% of the total production. I'm not sure if I've answered all your question, but I try to give you a short explanation.
I think it was a very accurate one. It was very well done. I shall watch it several times over afterwards just to reinforce my understanding. And I'm hoping to add to that understanding in another way, which I'll mention at the end of the show. Michael, you have a close relationship with the Louis Latour brand. It's obviously one you have a great deal of admiration for, and I have no doubt you have enjoyed plenty of the wine as a brand that is reflective of the Burgundy story, the wines of Louis Latour.
Okay, so I firstly think that, yes, I've known Louis Latour wines pretty well for most of my wine drinking life, and I've certainly visited those cellars for more than 40 years. So and I started very young, of course. But it has to be said that, and I think Bruno had an excellent point when he said, you can be big in Burgundy and still be smaller than a first growth. Louis Latour at one level is, I think, the biggest owner of Grand Cru vineyard in Burgundy. But if you add up all their Grand Cru vineyard, it's by no means even the size of a first growth in Bordeaux. So Burgundy, by its very nature, is made up of lots of very tiny parcels, some of them aggregated in the way that families do, some of them splintered in the way that families do, because inheritance means you can each go off with your single row of vines. What has been consistent in my experience of Louis Latour is that they make a traditional rather than an old-fashioned style of Burgundy. And that means that you do have to exercise a degree of patience. As I was saying before the show with Bruno, I've been tasting some of the very young wines that have just arrived in the country, and they are dangerously delicious, but they are still essentially very primary. They are delicious Pinot Noir, fruit juice with just enough alcohol to carry it forward. What happens as Burgundy evolves and it acquires secondary and tertiary characteristics is it becomes much more complex. And for me, that is what I love most about Burgundy, is the spice, is the perfume, is that sense of something which has got nothing to do with grapes and far more to do with really heady aromas. And I had a 2001 wine from Louis Latour at lunch yesterday, had to be decanted for 3 hours. And for the first time, literally, since I've had that particular Pommard, has it actually reached a point where it just gives an extraordinary amount of pleasure. So Latour's wines are slow evolving. You can behave very badly and catch them early in life, but it's infanticide. And if you are able to be patient and to keep them, 15 plus years, you have an extraordinary immersion in spice, aroma, delicacy, and detail. They're really hauntingly beautiful.
Well, if that hasn't got your pulse racing at the prospect of trying some, I'm not sure anything will. One half of the wines we are drinking this evening. Let's go to the other half and try them out. Technically, the first 3 quarters, because we've got 3 of them here. Give us the story behind your 3. You've got the Storm Ridge, you've got the Ignis, and we have the Vrede, if I'm not mistaken. So those are our 3. What differentiates them? What's the story behind these 3 wines, Hannes?
Then, so the 3 wines takes the same energy from us. It's more or less Vrede is in the Hemel-En-Aarde Valley appellation, so that is more from the Bokkenveld shale-derived clay soils. Also the closest to the cool Atlantic Ocean. Planted in 2008, as mentioned earlier, and that is just a wine that shows more the fruit, the floral perfumes, more the violet, rose petals, and then come a structure coming from the clay soils. So there's always a textural, fine-grained tannin structure from those soils. The elevation is about 125 meters above sea level on the Vrede vineyard, and then when we move up to the valley, it's about 2 kilometers as a crow flies between Vrede vineyard and the Ignis vineyard. Ignis, the Latin word for fire, making reference to the igneous rock granite. So we have this little granite, little portion of vines along the Onders River, the last vineyard block on the Onders River, and Ignis shows a bit more of the wild strawberry characters, spicy notes, and all those. And it also shows the tertiary characters a bit earlier than Vrede. It was also planted in 2008, and I remember 2012, first vintage year, we had only 1 barrel, and I think of those wines we probably have about 13 or 14 bottles left that we have not tasted for the past few years. We will utilize them into some vertical tastings coming up at some stage. Maiden vintage there also then 2012. Ignis is farmed organically since 2015, and then the wine, the 2019, was then still also organically farmed. We can get away with that here in the Hemel-En-Aarde. A bit more aeration here, the upper Hemel-En-Aarde. The disease pressure is lower, and then about 120 meters higher than the Vrede vineyard in elevation. So, and then from the Ignis vineyard, we move up the valley about 5 to 6 kilometers. And then we get the Reach Pinot Noir, which is in the Hemel-En-Aarde Reach appellation. So that is on the eastern slope, and it's one of our coolest vineyard sites. It's cooler due to 3 factors. It's higher in elevation on 330 meters above sea level, and it's on the eastern slope, while the other 2 vineyards are on northern slopes. So it only catches the direct morning sunlight, which has a great cooling effect. And because it's higher in elevation, it also has it's more exposed to the cool southeasterly winds. And there's always a prevailing wind there, much cooler than the other 2 sites. I remember I was involved in a project there in the early 2000s, collecting weather data over 2 years with data loggers, and it was really extraordinary to see the differences in temperatures. There's always a very cool climate compared to the other 2. So the Rich Pinot Noir shows a bit more spicy notes. The highest acidity of them, the tightest in the beginning, but then also more the darker fruit profile, more the blackcurrant, fruit pastel, lead pencil shavings. And that's basically just a bit of a wrap up between the three appellations that we work with, the 3 single vineyards. Production wise, about 6,000 bottles of each, so it's fairly small, and we handle them in lots of about a ton each. So it's about, let's say 20 tons across. We have about 20 open fermenters that we work with and punch downs regularly in the cellar and so forth. But as mentioned earlier, the most important is just the time of picking. Due to the fact that they are cooler, the sites are cooler in normal years, we usually will harvest them about a week from each other, which helps us quite a lot in the cellar from a logistical point of view. But soils then also from the Reach, again, the Bokkenveld shale soils, heavy clay soils, but much cooler than the Vrede. That's basically my story about those 3.
I suspect I know the answer to this, but I shall ask anyway. Is there a favorite?
It's basically to choose between your children. It's easy when you only have 1 child. So for me, it's more or less equal preference across the 3 wines. I would say maybe the Friede, because just because I was living there very close by the vineyard for more than 15 years, and I think but I don't really have a preference. There's a wine for every time and place.
Very diplomatically answered there, Mr. Storm. 3 cracking wines. I've got a mouthful of Friede with me at the moment, and it is as delightful as Michael suggested. Back to France, back to just southwest of Beaune, and I mentioned that for an important reason, which I'll come back to in a moment. Tell us a little bit about this very specific wine, and tell us a little bit about Centenay, if you will.
Centenay, it's a village that is about 20 kilometers away south of Beaune. It's about, the total size of the village is about 400 hectares, and 90% is planted with Pinot Noir. Only about 10% is planted with Chardonnay. It's actually, if you have the opportunity, an interesting wine to taste. When white, although it's a smaller production, it's an interesting alternative to Chassagne-Montrachet, which is the next door village. Interesting Centenay, although can be a little bit more red fruit driven. Sorry, it can be a little bit rustic as well, because it has some maybe a little bit firmer tannins that you would find further north in Volnay, for example. But it's always a good, very good introduction to the Côte de Beaune. In a region where, if you have been to Burgundy, you will know that when you move south from Beaune, you go to Pommard, which is a red village, Volnay, which is a red village. Then it's white, because you have Meursault, then you have Puligny-Montrachet, and then you reach the village of Chassagne-Montrachet, which is more white than red these days, but used to be more red. And then Centenay, which is, as I said, 90% red.
These are probably alien names to many of you. They are not to me, because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm almost finished a great book on Burgundy, and Beaune in particular, the photos, the stories, it just looks enchanting, as indeed as much of Burgundy. And so, Bruno, adding to my education, Michael and I have a monthly meeting. It's a very important, very serious meeting, where the agenda for the meeting is based on the wine list at said establishment. And we spend several very pleasant hours talking about food, wine, and the world at large. But we've muttered and mentioned about possibly a road trip. So I think a visit to Burgundy might be on the horizon. And as and when that does eventuate, expect the two of us knocking on your door in Burgundy.
Well, you're definitely most welcome. I mean, we are missing visitors. I like to say often that Burgundy, and especially Beaune, is the place where, as a wine lover, you should be visiting once a year, because there's always something new, there's always something different, there's always something to learn about, and foremost, it's one of the great, although it's a small city, it's one of the great capital when it comes to wine and food. It's a small town. I mean, there are only 21,000 people living here, but we have more than 200 restaurants, and well worth a visit. So we would definitely welcome you if you whenever you feel like coming to see us.
Fabulous wine estates, 200 restaurants. Expect a 100-day visit from myself and Mr. Fridjhon. We'll start scheduling that in our next meeting. Michael, in conclusion, just coming back to this Burgundy Hemel-En-Aarde parallel, we've seen over centuries and centuries and centuries the areas of France fine-tuning down to, this is the best grape we make here, so this is the only grape we will make here, either red or white. Hemel-En-Aarde has done that to an extent. You still get some lovely examples of other wines. I think of the Restless River Cabernet Sauvignon as a great example, but the focus is very much on Chardonnay and on Pinot Noir. Is that going to, in Hemel-En-Aarde in particular, South African wine in general, do you think that's a direction that we will head in, that we need to head in?
I mean, it's a question that needs a longer answer than we have time for, because on the one hand, I think it's very important, and we've seen it, where regions at least put their best foot forward and say, we are the home of Pinot, we are the home of Chardonnay, we are the home of Sauvignon Blanc, we are the home of Cabernet. But we also know that they don't exclusively do those varieties, and there are a number of reasons for it. You've touched on the first, which is that we don't have a long enough history. But there's a second, more crucial point now, which is that climate change may very well realign what certain appellations do relative to what they might have done 10, 20, or 30 years ago. What is really interesting, if we look at Hemel-En-Aarde, is that it's had a string of very fine and very good vintages, notwithstanding the impact of the drought, which I think by and large, Hemel-En-Aarde managed better than many other parts of the country. And that suggests that it has a tolerance for climate change that is more than, for example, other places. So I think what we're going to see is that Hemel-En-Aarde, for the time being, will be probably 80% Burgundian varieties. There will continue to be a lot of experimentation. And I think out of that experimentation, there will be some delicious wines. And if climate change really does make a major difference, it will at least show a way forward for the producers in the valley.
And a very last word then on that from Hannes. Hannes, based on what Michael has just said, his prediction, does that strike a chord with you? Are you of a similar view?
Definitely. I think if one look at the drought conditions that we've had here in the Hemel-En-Aarde, it took us a bit longer to really feel the drought, the bite of the drought. But I mean, after 4 or 5 years of dry conditions, it is difficult to buffer that. But I think because we're close to the cool Atlantic Ocean, I mean, a 12.5, 13% average temperature here, prevailing southeasterly winds. And then the Hemel-En-Aarde is a very narrow valley. So, and because it's so narrow, we have runoff from both sides of the mountains. And with the heavy clay content of the soils, I think we can buffer the climate change quite well. What is quite interesting from the climate change is the temperature and the climatic fluctuations. And I think, as I say in Afrikaans, a boer maak 'n plan. It's always possible to buffer that also. So I think we will see Chardonnay and Pinot Noir thrive for quite a long time. And as Michael also mentioned, all the other experimentation on the side, which creates some great things most of the times.
It's a fascinating discussion. It's one that sadly we have to bring to an end. We haven't even had a chance to talk about rugby or food or other such important areas. But I think we'll be able to pick those up because hopefully we'll have Bruno and Hannes back on the show again soon. But to both of you and to Michael, thank you all three. The barrels, the way they name wine in Burgundy, the comparisons between the two areas. It's been fascinating to have all three of you with us with some wonderful wine as an added bonus. So Hannes, I look forward to being down in Hemel-En-Aarde Valley soon. Bruno, I will be booking I'll be booking my ticket. Fridjhon only flies private jets these days, but I'll be booking my flight and we'll be headed over. And thank you all. It's been a really interesting hour and I really appreciate the time. So Michael, Bruno, Hannes, much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was great to meet you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Simon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So there we go. That's today's show. What a way to start the Monday with some sensational Pinot Noir. And I'm not going to rate one over the other. I'm simply going to tell you that the Hemel-En-Aarde Valley and Burgundy both have a wonderful, wonderful take on the art of Pinot Noir. So that is us for today. Remember, tomorrow, 8 o'clock, kicking off. It'll be every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 4 weeks, an 8-part series on entrepreneurship brought to you by Bosch & Dell, hosted by myself and Maps Maponyane. Our first guest is the social entrepreneur, Catherine Constantinides. That's tomorrow. Wednesday night, we're live from Element House at 5 o'clock with a special edition of the show celebrating the launch of the new vintage of the Element with very special guest Erica Obermeyer, one of our finest winemaking talents at the moment. Thursday, back here in the cellar, and Thursday we'll be looking at the new range from the Mentors at KWV, plus Mike Radcliffe. It has been a hell of a week for Mike, red wine producer and overall producer of the year worldwide at the IWS Seawards. And there's also David Higgs's new spot Zoo opening on Thursday night. It's a busy week, lots of wine to drink, lots of wine to talk about. We hope you'll join us for all of those conversations and more. See you back again. And in the meantime, keep drinking, keep supporting wine. Cheers. To join the Pick and Pay Wine Club, simply SMS your smart shopper number to 36775. It's absolutely free, and you'll get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every bottle of wine bought. You'll also get a 20% discount on 10 different wines each month, a 25% discount on a case of wine, and a Magnum, some terrific competitions and invitations to awesome events.